On January 8, 1815, a thick, damp fog lay over the marshy plain of Chalmette, just a few miles downstream from New Orleans. The air was heavy with the Mississippi's dampness and a deep, anxious anticipation. In this whitish haze, obscuring the outlines of cypresses and oaks, stood two armies, ready to decide the fate of an entire continent. On one side, impeccable ranks in red coats, veterans who had endured the fire of European campaigns and crushed Napoleon's armies. This was the elite of the British Empire, a machine working with clockwork precision. On the other side, behind a hastily erected earthen rampart, reinforced with cotton bales and logs, was the strangest and most motley force the world had ever seen. Tennessee hunters in coonskin caps, Creole aristocrats in silks, free people of color, Choctaw Indians, and even pirates from the bayous of Barataria. The morning silence was broken only by the distant beat of drums and the damp crunch of sugarcane under thousands of boots. None of these men, clutching muskets with dew-moistened hands, knew the main paradox of this moment. They were preparing to give their lives, perform feats, and make fateful decisions in a war that had formally already ended. Thousands of miles away, in the Belgian city of Ghent, the ink on the peace treaty had already dried. Diplomats had shaken hands, exchanged pleasantries, and gone to banquets. But in the era of sail and wind, news traveled agonizingly slowly. The ocean remained silent, and it was this silence that turned the field near New Orleans into a stage for one of the most dramatic and ironic tragedies in the history of warfare. Here, on the edge of the New World, time played a cruel trick, allowing ambition, honor, and chance to intertwine into a bloody knot that diplomacy could not untangle. To understand how thousands of people ended up on this patch of land between the great river and the impenetrable swamp, one must look at a map of that time through the eyes of strategists in London and Washington. New Orleans was not just a city, it was a key. Whoever controlled the mouth of the Mississippi controlled the breadth of the entire North American continent. For the young United States, whose economy and migration flowed rapidly westward, the river was the only artery connecting the interior territories to the world ocean. To cut off this flow would mean to choke the young republic, to sever it from the Gulf of Mexico, and perhaps forever limit its possessions to the Atlantic seaboard. The British command, weary of a protracted war on two fronts, saw in the capture of Louisiana an opportunity to deliver a decisive blow that would force the Americans to accept any terms of peace, or even to return these rich lands to the crown. The plan was grand in its scale and audacity. A huge fleet, carrying the empire's best regiments, was to enter the Gulf of Mexico, land troops, and with one powerful blow seize a city that seemed an easy prey. New Orleans of that era was a place of contrasts and contradictions, a melting pot of cultures, languages, and loyalties, where American rule, established just a decade earlier after the Louisiana Purchase, still seemed alien and temporary to many locals. It seemed that if the British lion merely roared, the city would fall into its paws like an overripe fruit. No one in London took seriously the man tasked with defending the region. Andrew Jackson, nicknamed _0_ for his inflexibility, was a controversial, sickly, and obsessive figure. Worn out by dysentery, with a bullet lodged in his shoulder after a duel, he stayed in the saddle only by the force of an incredible will and a burning hatred for the British, which he had carried in his heart since his teenage years. When an officer struck him with a saber for refusing to polish his boots. Jackson's arrival in New Orleans in early December of 1814 was a catalyst that turned panic into action. He found the city defenseless, its inhabitants bewildered, and its resources scarce. But it was here, in the chaos of preparation, that the first layer of conflict began to unfold. An external confrontation where the logic of military science clashed with the reality of the American frontier. Jackson understood that he had no time for drill and creating a regular army. He needed a miracle, and he decided to assemble it from what was at hand. His decision to enlist Jean Lafitte, the famous pirate and smuggler, in the defense became a legendary example of pragmatism. Lafitte, for whose head a bounty had been placed, offered Jackson not only men, but more importantly, gunpowder, flints, and artillery, which the defenders desperately needed. This alliance of lawman and criminal, general and privateer became a symbol of the entire campaign. For victory, all means were good, and social barriers crumbled in the face of a common threat. The British Armada, under the command of Admiral Alexander Cochrane, approached the coast, carrying thousands of soldiers under Major General Edward Pakenham on its decks. Pakenham was Jackson's complete opposite. Wellington's brother-in-law, a brilliant officer trained in the traditions of European military schools, he was accustomed to fighting by the rules. He believed in discipline, maneuver, and overwhelming firepower. However, the nature of Louisiana immediately began to dictate its terms. The shallow waters of the lakes prevented heavy British ships from approaching the shore closely, and troops had to traverse miles of swamps in boats, suffering from cold, dampness, and disease. Nevertheless, the British managed to achieve the almost impossible. They landed unnoticed and approached the city within striking distance. The sudden appearance of advanced British units at Villeray Plantation, just 7 miles from the city, caused a shock. Catastrophe seemed inevitable. But it was at this moment that a second layer of conflict emerged, an internal struggle of characters and will. Jackson, learning of the enemy landing, did not wait or fortify himself in the city. He uttered a phrase that became historical. "By the Eternal, they shall not sleep on our soil." Instead of defense, he chose a furious night attack. In the darkness of December 23rd, the Americans fell upon the British camp. It was a chaotic, brutal fight with knives and tomahawks where it was impossible to distinguish friend from foe. Although tactically the battle ended in a draw, strategically it was a victory for Jackson. It forced the British, accustomed to orderly battles, to stop and exercise caution. Pakenham decided to wait for reinforcements and artillery, giving Jackson precious time, the very resource the Americans lacked. While the British brought up their forces, Jackson's army transformed Rodriguez Canal into an impregnable fortress. Soldiers dug day and night, erecting an embankment that stretched from the Mississippi River to the impassable cypress swamps. This was not just a defensive line, it was a physical manifestation of American ingenuity. Everything was used: earth, logs, sandbags, and even bales of cotton, which the defenders hoped would absorb British bullets. Behind this embankment stood people who, in ordinary times, would never have met. Shoulder to shoulder with rugged frontiersmen from Kentucky and Tennessee stood elegant French-speaking Creoles, and a battalion of free blacks whose bravery would soon become legendary. Here also were the batteries of Lafitte's pirates, whose gunnery skills, honed in maritime plunder, now served the Republic. The third layer of conflict, philosophical and ideological, lay deeper than the trenches. It was a clash of two worlds, two systems of values. On one side stood old Europe with its hierarchy, where a soldier was merely a cog in a machine, an instrument of the monarch's will. The British Army acted as a single organism, governed by orders from above. On the other side was a young, bubbling democracy, chaotic and unpredictable, where individualism bordered on anarchy, but in a critical moment produced astonishing resilience. For the British soldiers, many of whom were promised, quote, "one" in New Orleans, this was another campaign for the glory of the empire. For Jackson's men, it was a fight for their homes, for their land, and, in a broader sense, for the right to determine their own destiny without looking to overseas lords. The issue of slavery added particular poignancy. The British, hoping to destabilize the region, actively encouraged slaves to flee and join their ranks, promising freedom. This created monstrous tension in the American rear, where the fear of rebellion was always great. And yet, paradoxically, free people of color rose to defend the city, understanding that a foreign invasion threatened their precarious status as well. The days leading up to the decisive battle were filled with artillery duels. On January 1, 1815, the British attempted to suppress the American batteries with a powerful bombardment. The ground shook, the air filled with smoke, but when it cleared, it turned out that the American cannons, sheltered behind an earthwork, were almost unharmed, while the British artillery was heavily damaged by return fire. Lafitte's pirates shot with devilish accuracy. This was another psychological victory, strengthening the defenders' belief in their own strength and sowing seeds of doubt in Pakenham's headquarters. The British general was trapped. He could not remain long in the swampy terrain without sufficient supplies, but retreating without a fight was unthinkable for the honor of British arms. He made a decision that would prove fatal: a direct frontal assault on fortified positions. Pakenham's plan was complex and required perfect coordination. One column was to cross the river to the west bank and capture the American batteries to turn them against Jackson's line. The main forces, formed into columns, were to approach the rampart under cover of darkness and fog, fill the ditch with fascines, bundles of brushwood, and climb the fortifications using ladders. On paper, it looked flawless. In reality, chaos ensued. The river current proved stronger than the engineers had calculated, and the crossing was delayed by many hours. But the most terrible mistake occurred in the 44th Regiment, which was tasked with carrying the fascines and ladders. In the confusion of night preparations and misunderstanding of orders, the regiment's commander, Lieutenant Colonel Mullins, forgot vital equipment. When the error was discovered, it was too late. The columns had already begun to move. The soldiers had to return, breaking formation and losing precious time. The situation transformed at dawn on January 8th. The fog, which was supposed to hide the attackers, suddenly began to dissipate under the rays of the rising sun, exposing the plain. Before the Americans, like in the palm of their hand, a terrifying and majestic scene unfolded. Thousands of soldiers in red coats marching in close formation to the sound of bagpipes. It was a sight worthy of a parade in Hyde Park, but here, in the Louisiana mud, it looked surreal. Instead of suddenly appearing at the very rampart, the British found themselves in the open, hundreds of yards from American muskets and cannons. And at that moment, as the first rays of sun glinted on the bayonets, time stopped for the British Army. The element of surprise vanished, giving way to the inevitability of slaughter. The climax came instantly. As soon as the Red Lines entered the kill zone, the American fortifications spewed forth a wall of fire and metal. Artillery, loaded with grape shot, cut wide swaths through the British ranks. But the worst was yet to come. As the British drew closer, the Kentucky and Tennessee riflemen entered the fray. Their long-barreled rifles, unlike smoothbore muskets, fired accurately and far. Officers in bright uniforms fell one after another, picked off by sniper fire. The formation broke, but the veterans, true to discipline, continued to advance, closing ranks over the bodies of their comrades. However, when the vanguard reached the moat, horror awaited them. There were no ladders or fascines. They found themselves before a deep ditch and a high earthen wall, unable to overcome it. To stop under such fire meant certain death. Pakenham, seeing the attack faltering, tried to personally inspire the troops. He galloped to the front, waving his hat, but was struck down by grape shot. One after another, generals who took command fell. The British army, leaderless, squeezed between the river, the swamp, and a wall of fire, turned into a helpless mob. This was not a battle, it was an annihilation. In a mere 20 minutes, the elite of the British infantry ceased to exist as a fighting unit. The field before the rampart was strewn with red coats, resembling, according to eyewitnesses, a bloody carpet. The Americans, in relative safety behind their fortifications, continued to fire methodically, reloading their weapons and passing them to the riflemen. The losses were incomparable. Over 2,000 British were put out of action, ending their earthly journey or receiving severe wounds, while the Americans lost only a few dozen men. When the smoke cleared and the firing ceased, the scale of the catastrophe for the British became evident. General Lambert, who had taken command, ordered a retreat. The Battle of New Orleans was over. But the story of this battle does not end on the battlefield. The true resonance of the events manifested later as news began to ripple through the waters of time. Weeks after the battle, a ship arrived in Washington with the text of the Treaty of Ghent, and almost simultaneously, messengers arrived with news of Jackson's incredible victory. In the public consciousness, these two events merged. Americans, unaware of the subtleties of chronology and diplomacy, perceived the victory in New Orleans as the reason for the successful end of the war. It seemed that this triumph forced the British to sign peace. It was an illusion, but an illusion so powerful that it became a reality in a political sense. The unnecessary battle gave the young nation what it so desperately lacked: a sense of pride, unity, and faith that it could stand against the most powerful nations in the world. The War of 1812, full of humiliating defeats, the burning of the White House, and an economic blockade, suddenly ended on a high, triumphant note. Andrew Jackson, the architect of this victory, instantly became a national idol. His popularity transcended state and party lines. He became a symbol of the common man, capable of defeating the aristocracy, a symbol of the frontier triumphing over the metropolis. The Battle of New Orleans paved his direct path to the presidency, ushering in the era of so-called Jacksonian democracy. This was a turning point when power in America began to shift from the East Coast elites to the new, rough, but energetic forces of the West. Lafitte's pirates received their pardons, dissolving into the legends and myths of Louisiana. The British Empire, licking its wounds, shifted its attention to other corners of the globe, forever abandoning attempts to reclaim its former colonies by force of arms. Today, looking back 2 centuries, we see in the Battle of New Orleans not only a tactical triumph, but also a profound lesson about the nature of information and time. We live in an age of instant communication, where messages circle the globe in fractions of a second, and it's hard for us to imagine that the fates of thousands of people could depend on the speed of the wind filling the sails of a mail ship. But even in our digital world, the essence remains the same. People's actions are often determined not by objective reality, but by what they know about it at a given moment. Pakenham's and Jackson's soldiers fought in the reality of war, while the world was already living in the reality of peace. This paradox reminds us that history is not just about dates and treaties, but also about human perception, emotions, and belief. When the fog once again descends on the Chalmette field, obscuring modern monuments and industrial structures, it's easy to imagine that January morning. The silence that reigns there now seems especially deep if one remembers the roar of cannons and the cries that tore through that air more than 200 years ago. The blood spilled on this land did not change borders on diplomats' maps, nor did it rewrite a single clause in the peace treaty. And yet, it changed everything. It forged the identity of a nation, proving that a motley crowd of free people, united by a common goal, could withstand the most perfect military machine of its time. It was a battle that shouldn't have happened, but without which modern America is impossible to imagine. And therein lies the main irony and grandeur of the event. Sometimes the most senseless battles turn out to be the most significant for the human spirit. History does not tolerate the subjunctive mood, and what happened in the fog near New Orleans forever remained inscribed in its annals as a testament that courage and determination matter, even when diplomats have already signed their names. If we listen to the echo of that battle, we will hear not only the sound of gunshots, but also the voice of a new era, which was born in agony and smoke on the banks of the Mississippi. This was the moment when America finally severed the umbilical cord connecting it to Europe and stepped into its own complex and contradictory future. And although the news of peace arrived late, the peace itself, which came after, was already completely different. A world in which the New World declared itself in full voice, with the voice of Andrew Jackson's guns. This voice echoes through the centuries, reminding us that there is nothing accidental in history, even if it is an accident caused by a mail delay. Every action, every choice, every feat leaves a trace that forms the fabric of our reality, regardless of what is written on paper thousands of miles from the scene.